Staying with us as we continue this morning. Each day, a vast majority of children throughout the world are subjected to abuse, neglect, exploitation and violence that come in different forms in their homes, schools, communities and work environments. According to Save the Children South Africa, a development and rights-based organization for children, violence against children cost the economy over 238 billion in 2015. Now, this morning, we will deliberate further on the impact of violence on the future of our children and the cost in the economy. Joining us in studio is Dr. Celia Shao, who is the research manager for Save the Children South Africa. You can be part of our discussion by giving us a call on 011 447 1742 or 011 447 2570. And you can also share your thoughts with us on our Facebook as well as our Twitter pages. Now, Dr. Celia, thanks very much for joining us this morning. So the minute you say 238 billion, that sounds like a lot. It's got a great impact on our GDP and all of that. But the question is, when we speak about the cost of violence, in a country when it comes to children, exactly how do we get to that numbers and what's the methodology behind getting to that?
Thanks so much, Penny, for having me here. It was quite a long process, and to jump right into the methodology of how did we get to 238 billion. It's 238.58 billion actually. There were quite a few steps. The first thing to note is we didn't actually interview children. It wasn't a primary research study. It's what we called secondary research analysis. So we looked at what research, what literature, and what data for South Africa was already available. And then you analyze that data. So the first thing we looked at was looking at the link. What does the literature in South Africa say in terms of numbers and evidence say? Physical violence, for instance, what is the impact that it has? In terms of the associations with drug abuse, the associations with alcohol abuse, association with getting involved in interpersonal violence, and then looking at that for sexual violence, for emotional violence and neglect. We can then find from the literature that strong link. From there, you can then look at, for example, you can map out a child who experienced sexual abuse, for instance, is 3.23 times more at risk of engaging in some form of drug abuse at some point in their life than a child who is not sexually abused. You can start getting these figures. Once you get that, we then factor in, for example, loss of productivity. A child who was emotionally abused, what is the loss of productivity that we see later on in life? So the 238 billion, essentially what it is, it wasn't looking at how much money we had and then we spent as a country, it's how much we lost, meaning children experience...
They could have contributed to make that money if they, if they were in a healthy state to be able to function fully.
If they were able to reach their full potential.
Full potential. Okay, so we want to reach a full potential as a nation, and I think most nations want to do that. So looking at this number, so obviously this is based on cases where there's a history of sexual violence, there's a history of emotional and physical abuse, and this is where we sit right now because those people have not reached their full potential. Now, we've spoken about how the cost is measured, but now, how can that be reversed?
So that's a great question, and that's very, very important. The first thing is prevention. So South Africa, we very much provide a lot of statutory responses, which is very important. We deal with violence once it happens. So now the push, we need to change our mindset to preventing violence before it even happens. The World Bank, for example, has come out and said, investing in prevention will yield higher returns than investing in response. So prevention is really the way we have to think.
Okay, some might argue and say, as a country, we have a lot of history of violence. We come from in the 80s, a lot of children being exposed to violence on television and violence in communities because of like protests and things like that. And in a certain extent, sort of like the community has become very... There's sort of paralysis of like, they're desensitized to violence. So that's going to take a lot of work to change that kind of mindset. Is that possible?
Absolutely, Penny. You've raised a really, really important point. Indeed, it's sort of in South Africa, it's become the norm. In many other parts of the country as well. So we're not unique in that way. But indeed, it is going to take a lot of time. But it is not something that's impossible. We can change our mindsets, and it needs to begin in the home, in the communities, as you've indicated, in the schools, for instance. But it is something doable. If we start understanding the impact that violence against children has on children themselves, the pain and suffering, and in terms of how it impacts their development as well as the economy, we can slowly get there.
Okay, for someone who says, children are very resilient, they come out of these situations, look at me, I'm fine, you wouldn't know what happened to me. That's because that's the general norm and how people have a conversation about when you say children are exposed to violence and they emotionally abuse. They're like, but there's nothing physical for it to show. How exactly does this impact the quality of life of a person?
So I'd like to pose that question. If somebody says, I was smacked as a child, I experienced violence, and look, I turned out okay. Well, I'd like to ask that person, how do you know you turned out okay? Are you sure? How do you know that the experiences that you had as a child of violence didn't close certain doors, for example? Every time you, for instance, in a history class, if you were smacked in a history class, how do you know because you turned away from history, that was an opportunity that was closed? You could have become a great historian, written historic novels, for instance, but because of that violence that you experienced in that class, you turned away. So how do we know for sure?
So we don't know. Okay, so let's take some Facebook comments as well coming through this morning. And we ask our viewers this morning, okay, and the question that we actually asked, what more can be done to protect children from violence and abuse? And these are the comments that came through. Leah saying, a platform to voice out their concern as well as a trustful place for them to report the violations. Most children are afraid to speak up because of their judged, told that they were actually at fault. Parents, guardians need to be patient and always offer a non-judgmental and understanding ear to children. We need to create continuous platforms where people are taught how to live, treat, accept their partners and families as they would automatically create a healthy community, and not only the campaigns that last for about a day or two. So as Save the Children, you're a global organization but working in South Africa. So my next question then would be, you're dealing with people who says, I turned out fine because they don't know. And then half of those people are raising another generation. So we have a lot of work to do as South Africa. And you spoke about how we need to focus more on reaction to prevention. So it's a mindset change type of a conversation. I mean, based on your research, what are the direct, immediate things that we can be doing? Some will say social development is doing something, the Department of Education is doing something. How is that speaking to the challenges that we're facing?
So one of the things that Save the Children South Africa is doing is we're working on parenting programs, positive parenting programs, to work with parents, exactly as what the guest on Facebook said, is working with parents and communities to change that mindset. So working with parents on how to communicate with children, on prevention. So before it gets to corporal punishment, before it gets to a smacking, before it gets too aggressive with children, is preventing that. How do you communicate with children? What are some of the techniques you can use? We call that positive parenting. Other things we're doing are in schools, working with teachers and school governing bodies, for instance, on positive discipline, shifting away from corporal punishment and using other forms that are more positive of disciplining children in schools.
So positive parenting is amongst one of the areas that you're looking at. Okay, so just give us an overview of the work that Save the Children really does. So is it advocacy? So others will say, okay, we've got policies, and I mean, we've got the Children's Act, but how many South Africans really engage with it and understand what it represents?
So Save the Children South Africa, we work at many different levels. One level is we work with communities directly, with children and communities affected in those programs. For example, positive parenting, positive discipline, as I've mentioned. We work with other NGOs as well. We also work all the way up with government. So earlier you mentioned Department of Social Development and Department of Health, Department of Basic Education. There are actually a lot of government departments involved when it comes to violence against children. Violence against children is one thing that we do at Save the Children. We do many other things. One of the things with government that we're working on, for example, is the budget. We really need to push. So our study essentially showed that if we can invest in violence prevention, we can actually help to build a stronger economy. That's essentially what the research said. So if that's the case, we need to work with Department of Social Development, because right now, for instance, their prevention and early intervention budget is less than 1% of their overall national and provincial budget. So we need to use evidence like this and work with them on how do we get there.
Okay, so there's always a conversation around how, for example, in South Africa, when there is protests and things tend to get violent, and I'm sure you saw with the fees must fall. based on what you've mentioned, like the impact of children who are emotionally abused or sexually abused, is there a link between how we tend to become violent as a people to maybe exposure to violence or and physical abuse when children are young? Is there a link to that?
That's a fantastic question, because the answer is yes. And we can look, when we look at the neuroscience literature looking at brain development,
yeah,
we actually show that children who are repeatedly exposed to violence as a child, early on in life, it actually changes their brain architecture and their brain biology, because children who are repeatedly abused, their toxic stress is constantly up. So they're constantly sort of on the go. They're waiting for the next meeting.
Stressful.
Yes. And when that happens, that toxic stress, it's a chemical. It actually impacts their brain development. So it impacts their memory, it impacts their learning, it impacts their attention. All of these, for example, it hinders their progress in school. But most of all, what you've touched on earlier is they become a little more aggressive, antisocial. They intend to also use violent ways of engaging with others because their self-control has reduced because all of those changes in the brain chemistry, etc. So exactly as what you said, indeed, children that repeatedly experience violence or exposed to violence, the experience that they go through, their brain development, etc., it has a huge impact on their later outcomes.
Okay. So looking at these numbers that we've touched on, what are the things that we ought to do as parents, as a community, as a country, to make sure that come 2030, because I think that's what the vision is to change how things are looking like. What do we have to do next? So how can I play a role? It's 16 days of activism. What can I do as an individual?
So the first thing is, at Save the Children, we believe it should be more than 16 days. It's great that every year we have 16 days, but we launched a campaign on the first day of 16 days of activism. It's Save the Children's Violence Unwrapped campaign, and we believe it should be 365 days. So for 365 days for the next 5 years, our Violence Unwrapped campaign, we will be raising this issue. We want to talk about it. We want individuals to be aware of it. We don't want it swept under the rug. We don't want the nation's children to experience all of this, and yet we only talk about it for 16 days. So for people to get involved, first of all, you can check out our campaign, Violence Unwrapped, but also for people to be aware of the impact that it actually has. We might think a smack is just a smack, for instance. We might think telling children such as, I hate you, you're stupid, I wish you were never born, it sounds very harsh. But to a little child,
it registers in the subconscious.
Yes, the person that's supposed to protect them is now hurting them, saying terrible things and doing terrible things. It has an impact. And they're going to grow up a certain way. Their risks are going to be increased of drug abuse, of alcohol abuse, of mental health illnesses, anxiety, depression. They're significantly more at risk of all these negative outcomes. So people need to be much, much more aware. And that's part of what we'll be doing for our Violence Unwrapped campaign.
Okay, well, Dr. Celia Shaw, thanks very much for coming through and enlightening us on this development. As we continue, of course, we've been speaking to the research manager at Save the Children South Africa, Dr. Celia Shaw, breaking down how we got to that 238 billion, the impact on children, on violence against children in our country. For more information, of course, you can go to savethechildren.org.za for more info. We're coming back with more. It is Sunrise live on ETV on a Hope Day Wednesday.
Celebrate our big savings at Rhino Cash and Carry and Rhino Liquor. 3-liter Namakwa Natural Assorted Wine for only R59.99 each. Buy 2 or more 750ml black and white whiskey for only R106.99 each. 450 gram Nudin white candles for a low price of only R15.99. And 350ml Copra or Sunbeam floor polish assorted for only R19.99 each. Rhino Cash and Carry. Ikama ongaletemba.
Hoba boima bonneteng e ka ba 10 million ya maAfrika Borwa a nang le sekoloto a morao ka ditefello. Ikopanye le ba National Debt Councillors hore ba lekole dikoloto